Greetings, everybody. Greetings, friends. I'm Ed Steinfeld, director of the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. I am so happy to see you all. We have a number of friends who've returned who I haven't seen in a long time throughout COVID, and it's just wonderful to be back in person and be doing events like this. And it's really particularly wonderful to be doing an event today, more than an event, really a celebration of this phenomenal new book, Partial Hegemony, Oil Politics and International Order, by our very own Jeff Colgan, who is the Richard Holbrooke Associate Professor of Political Science and International and Public Affairs. And Jeff, as you all know, is also director of the Watson Institute's Climate Solutions Lab. We're going to have ample time today to discuss the book with really fantastic experts. But let me just say personally how not just thrilled, but how provocative I found this book. It's insightful, provocative. You know, of course, I think we all recognize we need to understand oil politics today and oil politics of the 1970s simply to understand really the potential political and geopolitical solutions to the current climate crisis. I think that's indisputable. But I really urge you to read this book because Jeff's broader emphasis in the book on the idea that the global system doesn't represent or isn't composed of a single hegemonic order, but really that hegemony actually shouldn't be understood in purely binary terms, that there are actually a variety of subsystems of hegemony or partial hegemonies operating across multiple aspects of the international system. That's so important for understanding lots of things, including the rise of newer geopolitical powers like China, or even just how a bunch of areas, new areas in many cases, space, cyber, AI, how those might ultimately be governed or not governed. In terms of format, what we're going to do today is to have Jeff begin with some comments, and then we're going to turn to our three discussants. Let me introduce them in turn, and then I'll ask Jeff to speak. So the first to speak after Jeff will be Amy Myers-Jaffe, who's research professor and managing director of the Climate Policy Lab at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. Amy is really one of the world's foremost leading experts on global energy policy, sustainability, and energy economics. Her newest book, published this year, last spring, is Energy's Digital Future, Harnessing Innovation for American Resilience and National Security. Second to speak will be Daniel Drezner, professor of international politics, also at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts. Dan is a renowned scholar of international trade and globalization and global regulatory issues and statecraft. He's the author of numerous books, including the 2017 work, The Ideas Industry, How Pessimists, Partisans, and Plutocrats Are Transforming the Marketplace of Ideas. And as many of you know, Dan is also a widely read commentator in the Washington Post. And third to speak will be Jennifer Erickson, Associate Professor of Political Science at Boston College. Jennifer is a distinguished scholar of international security and arms control, as well as a scholar of the laws and norms of war. Her 2015 book, Dangerous Trade, Conventional Arms Exports, Human Rights, and International Reputation, won the 2017 Best Book Award in the American Political Science Association's Foreign Policy section. And with that, Jeff, I'm going to turn the lectern of the floor over to you. And again, congratulations on really just a phenomenal book. Yeah.
I'm going to take the mask off, which these days feels kind of transgressive, but also liberating. Thank you, Ed, for the introduction. Thank you to my fellow panelists for coming, and thanks most of all to all of you. It's great to see some friendly faces in the room. Many of whom I already know, so I love that, but also some new folks as well. And so it's a treat. This is a book that has taken me the better part of 7 years to write. So it feels nice to come across the finish line and to be able to share with you some of what I've learned over that time. And the story of this book really begins with the greatest peaceful transfer of wealth across borders in all of human history, which began in 1973. And up until that point, a small group of international oil companies known as the Seven Sisters controlled the vast majority of the world's oil reserves. And that gave them enormous power over countries like Iran and Venezuela because they essentially controlled the government budget of those countries. And so then in 1973, this little organization called the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, helped its members turn the tables on what were then the most powerful companies on earth. And they quadrupled the price of oil. They shifted decision-making authority and wealth, profits, to what we now call the global south. And this was an enormous shift in international order, and it had repercussions that reverberated for years afterwards. And that shift in international order really happened because the governing arrangements for oil, the Seven Sisters cartel, suddenly changed quite dramatically. And so I want to understand what happened there. And one way to see this really is to think about oil price volatility over time. So this graph shows you not oil prices, but the month-to-month change in oil prices. And for most of the last 150 years that oil has been a commodity, the price of oil has varied a lot. It's been quite volatile. That's true today. But there was this period from roughly the mid-1930s to the early 1970s where oil prices were incredibly steady. And that's because this cartel of companies we now call ExxonMobil, Chevron, BP, Shell, these companies had incredibly effective governing arrangements. Now, I'm not saying they were good arrangements necessarily, because they had some negative consequences, but they were effective. And in an age today where we face climate change and our world leaders, some of them are off in Glasgow right now trying to figure out what to do about that. The question about how to make international governing arrangements that are effective and that last seem like a question of first-rate importance. And so that's what this book on some level is really all about, is we want to know, when is order effective and durable, and when does it change? When does it break down? And to do that, we need a definition of what the heck is international order. And unfortunately, if you ask IR scholars about that, you will get many, many, many different definitions. So I'm just going to use John Eikenberry's, which is that order is the governing arrangements among a group of states, including its fundamental rules, principles, and institutions. So think of, the United Nations, the World Bank, NATO, etc. And if you take an IR course here at Brown or most other universities, you'll get kind of a standard model for how to explain international order and when it changes. And I'm giving you the really crude version here, but the basic gist of it is that there's a big war, like World War II, and out of that war emerges a victor, that we call the hegemon, who then sets the rules for what's coming next, that post-war period until the next big war. And that's how international orders get set. And of course, there's debates among scholars about the dynamics of this, but most of our big theories agree that hinge years like 1815 or 1945 play a really crucial role, and that it's the great powers that are driving these changes, setting the rules. Trouble with this is that the events I just told you about in 1973 don't really fit this theory very well at all, for three reasons, at least. One is that there was no major power war. There was a war, but it was between relatively minor powers. Second, the great powers, at least the United States, was actively resisting this change rather than driving it. And third, it wasn't just states, but also non-state actors like OPEC and oil companies that were playing a crucial role in how international order worked. And so I want to do better than our existing theory. That's our job, right? Is to push theory forward on some level. And the question here in some ways starts with, well, what do we really mean by hegemony? If we go back to that sort of standard model, If you look for a definition of hegemony in an IR textbook, you'll probably be disappointed because either they won't define it at all, or it'll be something pretty simple like it's the leading state. And so theorists tend to think of it as like an on-off switch. You either are the hegemon or you're not. And if you are, then you're dominant across a whole lot of different areas, right? So you're the strongest state militarily, but you're also the biggest economy. You're the leading state technologically. You have control over flows of resources, capital flows, information flows, etc. In reality, that's not the way the world typically works. There might be a few moments in time where you could argue that there was a state that had something like that, but most of the time, a state could lead in some of those areas, but not all of them. And that's the term, that's the condition that I term partial hegemony, right? And that's hence the title of the book. And so if we start thinking about hegemony in this way, where it's not kind of all encompassing, sweeping the waterfront of different powers, then what does that mean for international order? Well, part of the challenge here is that we can't really get into, well, we have disagreement amongst people about whether the international order has changed, let alone why it's changed, right? So we can't get to that question about why it's happening or analyzing it if we're still debating whether it's changed. And if you look in journals like Foreign Affairs or Foreign Policy or many other places these days, the pages are filled with debates, not just among, folks like us sitting at the top of the room here of scholars, but also among policymakers about whether the liberal international order has changed fundamentally. And there are people saying, yes, look at the mess in our trade system, the rise of China. And there are others who say, no, 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 look at the fundamentals. They have not changed all that significantly, right? The US still has more guns, more allies, more dollars than anyone else, or at least they have some control over the central currency. And the thought I have about this is that this debate is intractable so long as we keep thinking about the international order as a single thing, right, as one piece. And if you start to think of international order as having a whole bunch of moving parts, some of which are changing and some of which aren't at any given moment, then you start to see the world in subsystems. And that's the kind of core theoretical move in the book, is to define and then think about subsystems, right? Which are collections of state and non-state actors linked by a kind of core question of governance, right? Imagine an atom with electrons where you've got actors orbiting this central question. And we might have multiple subsystems that collectively make up a total international system. And I'm going to give an example in just a minute, but just to drive this idea home, right? If we start thinking about international order as located at this subsystem level rather than the system level, then change isn't necessarily linked to hegemonic change. It's associated with the conditions that are specific to that particular subsystem. Okay, so then get to oil. And I've talked a lot about international order. When I think about order, I spend 3 or 4 chapters in the book retracing the last 100 years of history fairly quickly of oil politics. And I do it in the context of 2 core subsystems. And one of those subsystems is the production one, which is really all about answering the question, how much oil should we produce collectively, right? So actors like Saudi Arabia and Russia and OPEC are all on a day-to-day basis trying to match supply and demand. And so if we decide how much oil to produce, that obviously has really important consequences for prices, right? And for price volatility. So it's an enormously important subsystem. That's the one that the Seven Sisters cartel was so dominant in for a while, and has now been replaced much less effectively by OPEC. And we can pay a lot of attention to that, but there's a second subsystem that's sort of lurking in the background here and that often gets missed. And that's centered around the question of who has sovereignty over the oil fields? How are the world's oil fields distributed politically? And this question turns out to be so important that countries are willing to go to war over it. That most vividly in 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait and then rolled its tanks into eastern Saudi Arabia with the aim of seizing oil fields and giving a plausible threat to becoming a kind of quasi-monopolist of the global oil system. Well, this was something that the net oil importers, United States and others, could not bear. And so an international coalition came into being. Bush tried to deny that this was about oil in any way, but in fact, if you look at the national security meetings leading up to it, it was very clear that this was about oil. And that coalition pushed Iraq back out of Saudi Arabia and Kuwait ultimately. And so that event illustrated something that actually is really important within this second subsystem, which is sort of the backbone of it, are these oil for security arrangements between a powerful protector state, today the United States, and an oil producing petrostate. And they form kind of the basis of relationships like the one between the United States and Saudi Arabia, where basically the state like the United States provides military protection, and in exchange, the petrostate provides some economic benefits linked to oil. In the old days, it was the actual oil. Now it's a little bit more complicated. They find different ways of paying off, but there's a bargain here between these states. And that bargain varies a little bit between what states are being paired and over time, over history. But the basic gist of it has been remarkably steady going back to the 1940s and 50s, right? So when President Roosevelt met King Ibn Saud on the USS Quincy in 1945, this was one of the sort of kind of symbolic moments of this oil for security deal. It's developed over time, but it's been quite remarkably steady. And if we think about going back that far in time, you have to think about the conditions of world politics at that point. Empires like the British Empire, French Empire, the European empires were a real force in world politics. In fact, they were maybe the dominant force at that period. And that's important because at the time it really meant that these two subsystems worked hand in hand and were together. But ultimately, decolonization happened, and that had a really important implication for the way this system worked. And I'm not going to go all the way through that. If you're interested, please buy the book and give it to your dog, your cat, your babysitter, your auntie, etc. But the basic punchline of this story really is that decolonization helped upend one of these two subsystems, the one around production, and the Seven Sisters cartel got disrupted dramatically by that. But many of those same actors, like Kuwait and Saudi Arabia and others that were so busy disrupting the cartel in the 70s, wanted at the same time to preserve their oil for security arrangements and keep those going. And so you've got this really sharp difference, not that there was no change in one and all change in the other, but very distinct patterns of change on one hand and continuity on the other that you might miss, you might be blind to if you think about international order as just kind of one coherent. I know I'm running short on time, so I'm going to stop with my last slide here and just say this to summarize. International governing arrangements matter a lot, and they only work under some conditions. They only last under some conditions. And so learning from them is part of the job of international relations scholars. And so the move in this book is to move from the particular oil history to the abstract IR theory, and then come back again to another issue, namely climate change. And to my mind, climate change is the defining challenge of our times. And it is intimately linked to the politics of energy. And so to the extent that this book can help its readers think more clearly about that challenge, then if it does that, it will have served its purpose. So thanks so much for coming and listening.
Okay, do you want me to come to the podium?
It's entirely up to you.
I guess we'll do that and then we have the discussion.
Yeah.
Since one
Remember, you
has-
can take your mask off, though. That's the big thing.
Yeah, well, it's to be able to, even if I don't, just to be able to project.
Yeah.
So let me emphasize what an incredibly brilliant book this is. And a little older than Jeff. And so some of the things that Jeff's describing, not the things from World War II, but some of the Iraq War, some of these other things, like I was at the OPEC meetings, right? Or I was at the Pentagon. So, he's captured a dynamic that's really interesting. And it's a framework that I think has much more explanatory power than the other frameworks that we've traditionally used. And so that's what really impressed me about the book, because for us who are scholars, when you're stuck trying to fit some widget into a framework that doesn't really fit and doesn't have enough explanatory power, it makes it difficult for people like myself, who's a scholar that is really just down in the weeds about oil or down in the weeds about now, the geopolitics and policy of climate change. You're having a fight or push against some way of thinking about the world, US versus Russia or US versus China. And everybody's trying to put everything that happens into that box, right? But if it's not the right box, you're going to analyze the US relationship with China incorrectly. And you're going to have policymakers make errors, unforced errors, because all the analysis that's coming to them is with a framework that's a war-oriented framework, when we need to not be thinking in a war-oriented way, right? So this book really is just a brilliant book, truly. It's really could make an unbelievable contribution. If people would read it and pivot how they think about international institutions, we'd be in a better world. So I really want to congratulate Jeff. And let me put it in a context. A bunch of years ago, the Sloan Foundation, which is an excellent organization, had a very smart program officer who's still there. And he came to me and said, I'm going to give a grant to an organization called the Council of Foreign Relations. And the grant is going to have, I want them to pick out who they think are going to be, the 5 top new scholars in this field. And we want you to come in as like an advisor and come to their presentations and give them feedback on their papers and so forth. And Jeff was one of those scholars. And I can't wait to call Evan Michelson, the program officer, and tell him what a brilliant thing he did. Okay, and I'm not just saying that because Jeff invited me here, right? I'm saying it because it's really true. So what I'm going to do, because I think it'd be fun, right, is I'm going to take what's happening right now in Glasgow with Saudi Arabia and Russia and President Biden, and I'm going to use Jeff's framework to explain to you what's going on right now. And I'm going to show you how powerful it is. And then maybe later in our discussion, I can talk about climate change and the climate club thing, but I'm going to do the Saudis first because it's his explanatory power of what's going on is so great, okay? So one of the things that we all think is that, the United States is the hegemon, and then the whole world revolves around the United States because we're unable to get out of our own heads that we're exceptional. And so we underplay how much power a country like Saudi Arabia has. And we say that they only have power because we give it to them because we protect them. But that's not really true. Saudi Arabia has innate power from the fact that they could single-handedly change the price of oil on their own, whether the United States wants them to or not. And of course, 1973 proved that. But they have to have certain conditions. You know, demand has to be rising. We can't be in a recession. Like, we're not going to go into the whole economics of it. It doesn't always work. They don't always have power. They sometimes have power. And it depends what else is going on in the global economy. It depends what else is going on in technology. I believe we're going to find a day, what my book is about, where they're going to lose that power. And then we have to worry about how they might reassert their power in some other way, because they no longer have oil as their vehicle. Same with the Russians. Okay, but right now, if you were in the leadership of Saudi Arabia and Russia, your highest priority would be not to lose that power. So what would you not want? You would not want a substantive agreement at Glasgow. And you would not want President Biden and his agenda. You wouldn't want him to stay as president. You'd want the Democrats to lose in the midterms, right? Like, you can understand, using Jeff's framework, what are these actors, and then you take his tools that he says, okay? So governments have these tools that we've assigned to a hegemon, which is either coercion, right? Or changing a government, or giving an incentive, right? Those are your three tools, correct? Okay, so let me rephrase some of the history that Jeff went over using his framework in a really succinct way. Saudi Arabia coerces others by dropping the price of oil at an opportune moment when the market is vulnerable, and trying to bankrupt them to change their foreign policy. And they've done it 3 times successfully, right? And 2 of those times, they changed the government of that country and destroyed the entire economy of the country and changed the political system. So the first time was in 1988, 1989, was started in 86, right? But they made this price war kind of in tandem with the United States. We've all heard the story about Ronald Reagan and the Soviet Union and so forth. But Saudi Arabia dumped the price of oil. They were unhappy about the invasion of Afghanistan. They saw that as a security threat. They were aligned with the United States. They dumped the price of oil. And we know how the story ended. The Soviet Union disintegrated, right? That's time number 1. Time number 2, 1998, Asian flu, right? There's a little setback in the economies in Asia. Venezuela had announced that unlike the Iraq-Iran thing, where there was the Kuwait-Iraq conflict, where there was a conflict about oil policy, which also I could make fit into Jeff's framework, but anyway, won't go there for right now. Saudi Arabia decided they didn't like the idea of Venezuela aligning with the United States and standing up, and if Venezuela could get to 7 or 8 million barrels a day with American company assistance, they would be as powerful in the oil market as Saudi Arabia, and the United States would have more flexibility, right? The Saudis would be less powerful relative to America. We need them less, and they'd be able to influence us less and blackmail us less. So they made a price war in 1998. Price of oil went to $10. We all probably forget about that. And guess what happened? The entire government of Venezuela was swept out. Hugo Chavez came in, and the Saudis have kept them under pressure off and on over the years. And that whole country has been completely decimated. Their oil industry has literally been destroyed. All the reserves under the ground in Venezuela, in my opinion, will never be produced, right? So that's time number 2, right? Time number 3 was 2009. Price of oil is going up. Russians roll into the Ukraine. United States, President Obama needs to do something about that. Oh, I got to get the timing right. When did the Russians go into the Ukraine?
2014.
2014. Okay, I got the wrong crisis. Sorry. Okay. It's because the Saudis told me about this in 2009, and then it happened in 2014. So the point is, 2014, we're having this rise in the market, right? The Russians are in the Ukraine. President Obama organizes Qatar, the UAE, and the Saudis to work in tandem. And they put, this never made the press, they put something like 100 million barrels of oil in tankers and floated it off the coast of Fujairah. And the Obama administration told the Russians that if they went past Crimea, all of that oil would be released instantly into the market. And the Qataris took every spare barrel of liquefied natural gas that they had and they dumped it into Europe. And they told the Russians that they'd do more unless if the Russians moved past Crimea. And it wasn't in the newspaper, right? But anyway, long story, definitely was true. And we had, the collapse in the price of oil. So that did not change the government in Russia, right? But it was an act of coercion in a geopolitical sense. And then, but since then, right, the United States-Saudi relationship has been more shaky. For reasons that are complex, and I only have 7 minutes, so I won't go into, right? But you're Saudi Arabia, you don't want a climate accord. I mean, you're pivoting in case there is one to hedge your bets, right? You're going to hydrogen and, you say you're going to do carbon sequestration. But the bottom line is your goal at Glasgow is to make sure things don't move forward, right? And that happens to suit Vladimir Putin this year too. So what do? They take their oil out of the market at a time when we're having the V-shaped recovery. Gasoline prices are going up in the United States. Republican politicians are blaming President Biden. He's under pressure. If he does something about oil prices, he'll piss off the Progressive Party because he's putting more oil in the market, and that's like causing emissions, right? So they've boxed President Biden into this very difficult place because in the end, they'd like to see him not be reelected. And they'd like to see the Democrats tossed out of the Congress, right? And they're using the same coercion that I've described to you that they used against the Russians and against the Venezuelans, now against our own president. And if you were an IR theorist, you wouldn't be able to, all the people who are writing all these articles in foreign affairs about China, and I did one, so, I got it. But the point is, and read it because it's about clean tech and climate change. But my point to you is that all those articles don't explain what I just explained to you. Jeff's thesis explains it really explicitly. And I can see it clearly because I have to deal with it every day, but it's hard for other people to see it. But when I read his book, I thought, oh my God, that's going on right now. Saudi Arabia is trying to coerce the United States. And there have been other times in other elections where the Saudis have used their power with oil prices to influence the US election by either raising the price of gasoline or lowering the price of gasoline for a particular period in the United States, to either help someone get reelected or help someone not get reelected. And I'd have to sit and think about it. Maybe Jeff and I will do an interesting article about that together, after this event. But it really, this whole subsystem tells you a whole different layer about the limits of the United States power, that the whole oil insecurity literature about how we protect the Saudis in exchange for the oil doesn't tell you anything about, right? So I just wanted to kind of throw that out there because it's so today that you can use this theory that Jeff has constructed to come up with a good explanation for what's happening today. And then when you think about the US policy options, then what should President Biden do? So, number one, should he or shouldn't he, which he's been debating, release the Strategic Petroleum Reserve and get the Europeans to do the same thing? Right? You could argue, which I do, that we're going to get to electric cars, we're going to get to these other regulations, and so we're not going to need as large a Strategic Petroleum Reserve because oil demand is going to fall, at least in California and some other parts of the United States. And so therefore, we don't have to have as large a Strategic Petroleum Reserve. And then on top of that, the Congress, frankly, already under Trump, allocated to sell it. So why not sell it now to undermine this coercive behavior, right? When you explain it in Jeff's framework, I think the president could understand better why it's a good option for him, right? But maybe there's some other thing the United States could do that has nothing to do with oil, right? That they would do to counter these two activities and get, more progress at Glasgow. But that's how you'd have to get the NSC and others supporting the president. That is the conversation that you would have to have when you're talking about the Saudi Glasgow meetings, where the United States was focused on getting Saudi Arabia to make a commitment to net zero by 2050 or 2060. So it looked like they weren't rowing in the opposite direction. And, that wasn't the problem, right? And it was like a Band-Aid. So anyway, just want to leave you with that power of Jeff's model and framework for explaining what's happening right today on both climate change and the geopolitics of energy.
I don't quite have the ability to project my voice as my colleague, so I'm taking my mask off. But I want to congratulate Jeff on a fascinating book. Not just fascinating, I would describe it as both ambitious and provocative. It is literally a rebuke of international relations scholarship on not one, not two, but 3 levels, which is pretty impressive, I got to say. Specifically, it's in terms of the presentation you heard today, it's a rejection of the sort of standard potted history of international political economy of OPEC exercising power from 1973 on, that even some realists have articulated. That in point of fact, OPEC is what Jeff refers to as a rational myth now, which is the belief that everyone thinks it has some influence, even though it actually doesn't. And in fact, the peak of OPEC's influence was actually prior to 1973, rather than after 1973. More generally, is a rebuke, as he has said, to the ongoing debates about the liberal international order, suggesting that most of the focus on this has been wildly misplaced on the Sino-American relationship, on the idea of order as a singular thing. Whereas Jeff's subsystem theory, which in some ways you can say is creating a sort of new unit of analysis that we would all want to study, suggests that contra most studies of international order, sharp changes occur, discrete breaks occur in peacetime more often than they do at the end of hegemonic wars. That is a legitimately provocative point, and one that requires a lot of consideration. But even more generally than that, okay, it's not just about OPEC. It's not just about the international order. He is challenging scholars because basically he is arguing in this book that the entire field of international relations is way too obsessed with the notion of causal inference and not enough with descriptive inference. Now, I'm not sure if you guys even understand what those terms mean beyond, the actual PhDs in the audience. Basically, causal inference is asking what causes an outcome that we care about. Descriptive inference is, what does the world actually look like? Who are the key actors? What are the actual variations that we see? It's literally description. And in some ways, most of what international relations scholarship does takes that part for granted. It assumes that we've got that, and then we can try to explain causes. Jeff's point is we don't actually have the description down terribly well. And because of that, we're producing some blinkered theories. So you would understand what I mean when I say that this is all, pretty provocative. So, and furthermore, I would also suggest that there's a reason why I think Colgan's book, why Jeff's book prefers thick description. He's got a great story to tell. The OPEC story is awesome. And as someone who's not necessarily that well versed in it, I learned a lot of facts. My favorite one, hands down, is that one of the co-creators of OPEC was inspired by the Texas Railroad Commission to come up with the way that OPEC would actually operate. That is just one of those wonderful facts that I will never forget. It's burned into my skull, and I'm always going to remember that. It says something here that is, as Amy points out, there's a chapter in here on how to address climate change, and I don't think that's the biggest swing Jeff is taking in this book. So that's impressive. Now, the question is, does the work match the ambition? Okay, those are 3 big swings. So looking at these 3 levels of analysis, let's consider the energy subsystem that he describes, really 2 subsystems, as he says. In the immortal words of Larry David, pretty good. Okay. I wanted more on this. I wanted more on the market response, in fact, to the surge in oil prices from 73 to 86, because in some ways what we're seeing now is, responses in terms of things like both fracking as well as alternative energy. And I was surprised fracking doesn't get mentioned once in this book. I'm also curious because I was reading your book in tandem with Emily Meyerding's book. And you talk a lot about rational myths, of OPEC. I kind of wondered whether oil security was also a rational myth. Because, outside of actual war fighting, I'm not sure oil security is all that much of a thing. And I was struck that you say on page 113 about scholars being part of the problem. And so I kept wondering, are scholars saying oil security is a thing part of the problem? So I was sort of curious about that. I was also curious why oil and why no other commodity cartels. In other words, whatever you think about OPEC, they clearly did change something. And as you point out, that's a really big shift. Lots of other commodity producers tried the exact same thing in the late 1960s and early 1970s and failed. And I want to know why that didn't work as well. And so those would be interesting. Oh, and then finally, and this is sort of a contrary point to what Amy said, but it's worth noting, whether US preferences on energy prices have switched. It used to be for 30, 40 years, the assumption has been that the US prefers low energy prices because that benefits consumers, that benefits the economy, supply boom, and so on and so forth. The last 5 years, 6 years, I'm not so sure that's true. In particular, I think Democrats have learned one of the lessons from the 2016 election was that one of the reasons they lost was that oil prices were low in 2014 and 2015. That affected fracking, which led to an industrial recession in the Midwest, which cost them the election. And so I kind of wonder, are Democrats thinking that way? Is that a sort of scarring lesson for them or not? In terms of the debates about international order and the analytical leverage offered by a subsystems approach, I'm pretty enthusiastic. The good for this is pretty obvious. This allows for a lot more nuance. As an IP scholar, it fits in with how you can have shifts in trade or finance and investment without a great power war, that you can have orders change over time. It would have been useful to have this book when I wrote The System Worked, because in terms of thinking about subsystems, I like the fact that you sort of also talked about how it's governance structures on multiple levels. So I wasn't, in some ways that's what I was doing. I wasn't just talking about what the IMF or the World Bank was doing. I was talking about what the Fed was doing. And in some ways, those are all parts of the same system.
You'll be dismayed to know that there was actually a whole section about your book, about The System Worked, that I had to cut.
Oh, screw you.
I know.
Screw you, Colgan. Unbelievable.
And I was told by multiple people.
To take it out?
That's fair. That it deserved to be its own.
Oh, okay.
So that's the goal. Yeah.
And I would legitimately say it's very useful in terms of thinking about China now, whether or not China is a revisionist actor, in that essentially if you break down the single order into multiple subsystems, like Jeff does, like Ian Johnson has done in his work as well, it suddenly makes a lot more sense. And it's also very useful for thinking about the role that non-state actors play in orders as well. A few questions I have, or puzzles that I want to know a little bit more about. The first is whether or not punishments are as important as you think in terms of setting up these orders. You're very, insistent on that, and I can see why, given the subsystem you're looking at. But there are systems that, for lack of a better way of putting it, are recursive in their structures, which is once you set up the structure, you don't really need a punishment mechanism, because trying to deviate from that structure, you're trying to fight the market, you're trying to fight networks, you're not going to win. Short of that great power war, short of that massive systemic collapse, you're not going to be able to do it. And so I'm not sure punishments matter as much there. And so I kept thinking, WWST, what would Susan Strange think on this? And it's worth considering. You state that, I guess another question I have is how fungible is power in your theory? Because you say at one point that, power is sort of specific to each subsystem, which is fair enough. But then when you talk about sort of how these things are enforced, it boils down to essentially the use of force, the use of sanctions, and leadership selection. Those are pretty general, skill sets. And so I kept wondering, maybe, do hegemons, if they have those capabilities, actually have, influence over more subsystems than you might think? In other words, is it as complicated as you're suggesting? And that basically is the difference from subsystem to subsystem, the normative structure, the norms that are allowed. Decolonization plays a huge part in your story, and justifiably so. I think that's absolutely correct. But I kept wondering what would cause other norms to shift. The third sort of big question is the intercoder reliability problem, which you acknowledge, to be perfectly fair. And so I think I wanted to know a little more about that. And then I guess in some ways, like, what is exogenous and what is endogenous to each subsystem? So, to give an example, let's think about global supply chains now. I mean, I assume that could be a subsystem. Is the Fed and macroeconomic policy an exogenous shock to that, or is it endogenous to that system? Because you can argue the reason we have a global supply chain crisis now isn't because of the global supply chains. I mean, it's partly because producers, mistook what their future economic forecast was. It's that actually the Fed and Congress and the European Central Bank did their job correctly and engaged in massive fiscal and monetary stimulus. And therefore, that's why, global supply chains are clogged. And then finally, on the emphasis of descriptive inference more than causal inference. I would say on the one hand, you are preaching to the choir here. I agree. God knows, the number of times people think they get something wrong, or have committed bad causal arguments based on a misunderstanding of what's actually going on. No denying that. I just want to offer one caveat, because your other research, which doesn't appear in this book, obviously, on research and teaching practice in IR, gives me pause. Because as you point out in that work, we are still a very paradigmatic field. And therefore, descriptive inference can be just as theory-laden as causal inference. In other words, what we see or what we think is important often depends upon the theories that we are bringing to the table. This is often pointed out in terms of explaining causal stories, but it also is how we see the world. And so I just sort of wonder to what extent we wind up having debates about, concepts and typologies rather than causal mechanisms. In other words, I'm not sure you've solved a problem. What I think you might have done is moved it from talking about causes to talking about description. But still, as a counterweight to the causal mechanisms mafia, this is welcome. I applaud your hit on them. I will think of you from now on as the Michael Corleone of correcting how we should go about our field. And you should all buy this goddamn book. Thank you very much.
Tough act to follow.
That is a tough act to follow. I have been teaching in person since last fall, and I'm going to take my mask off in a classroom for the first time. This is pretty amazing. I am really delighted to be here. Congratulations to Jeff again. We can't say this enough, right? It's a huge accomplishment. It's a monograph that I am confident will provoke, as we've already seen, many debates and conversations in IR in the years to come. And on a personal note, I'm really honored to be here, part of this excellent panel, to celebrate a scholar who I've always found to be thoughtful, welcoming, generous, and very broad-minded in terms of bringing together important questions about security, political economy, and global governance. Rare to find all of that in one person. And I think you can see a lot of that coming together in this book. I also want to say this is really exciting because next week in my undergraduate seminar on globalization and national security, I'm teaching on oil wars. So now I get to tell them that I know Jeff Colgan and I got to comment on his new book, and he signed my book, which will impress them like more than anything else I'm going to tell them this entire semester. They're going to be like, oh, okay, maybe she's worth listening to sometime. So I'm going to echo, I think, some of Dan's comments here. I'm going to say, I think that partial hegemony is extremely ambitious in its agenda, but I also think there's some very modest pieces to it too. It's ambitious. I'm going to tease you a little bit on this, Jeff, and say there are very few people who I think could truly title their book in a direct reference to Bob Keohane's landmark After Hegemony and get away with it and get a Keohane blurb on the back. So I think that's really saying something about where you're kind of trying to like aim this book here. But more seriously, I think Jeff seeks to take on massively important and challenging questions that have long dogged the field, not just into today's debates about the liberal world order and its decline, but also we've seen this in the 1970s, and the 1980s, and the 1990s. This isn't a question that's going away. And so these questions more broadly about how do we explain order are no small thing, and they're really important. And even more challenging, how do we explain change in order? I'm not sure that IR will ever really come to agreement on answers to these questions, but they keep coming back. And I think their persistence and resurgence tells us that these are important conversations that we should be having, that we should be trying to think about it in simultaneously innovative and accurate ways. And I think Jeff really emphasizes that accuracy piece. And that if well done, our answers have the potential to have consequences we'd hope for the unfolding of international politics itself, but if not that, at least for scholarship in the study of international politics. In other ways, though, I think partial hegemony is modest. It seeks to remind its readers about doing good social science, knowing our issue areas and our cases, and not just being caught up into big methodological or theoretical trends. And he's kind of bringing us back down to earth with this a little bit, I think. Jeff asks us to return to theoretical principles and ideas that are long grounded in IR that maybe need some updating and integrating, but also have been ignored maybe as scholars seek out the new for the sake of the new. Many of the theoretical principles on which partial hegemony is built really resonate with how I've long thought and read and taught about issues of global governance and cooperation in particular. So in doing this, I don't think Jeff is seeking to present us a grand theory of everything. I don't think, I mean, maybe he is, but rather he's telling us to look to lower levels of governance and governing arrangements to see more nuance in international politics across issue areas and be careful in making too sweeping of statements about the liberal world order as if it is some kind of coherent whole. His ability to point to mechanisms and lower level change has the possibility of maybe resonating throughout the system more broadly, but doesn't necessarily do so. We're not sort of trapped in sort of a determinative argument here. So I think it is a both useful and empirically rooted approach to change. So much of partial hegemony is, as you've seen, dedicated to laying out Jeff's subsystem theory and applying it carefully to a century plus of international oil politics. It is a fascinating and cogent read for a non-energy politics reader like myself. But as a non-expert, rather than commenting on that side of partial hegemony, I think I'm partly here to take Jeff's subsystems theory out for a broader spin. And I'm going to do that with arms control nuclear, in part because Jeff has a short nuclear case in the book and conventional both. And so I want to take you through sort of the questions that he says as scholars we should be asking about the topics we're studying. First, Jeff presents 4 key questions with which to implement subsystems theory. And the first 2 are a really basic question, one I think we should always be asking ourselves, and I try to get my grad students to ask, is what are the primary empirical patterns? What is the political behavior of interest that we're looking at? Right? Pretty basic, but I think really, really important and a really important starting place for research. And then the second question is, what are the questions? What are the key questions of governance? And here in arms control, the empirical patterns that interest me the most are taking place in multilateral fora that we might consider the governance structures themselves. I might start by observing the weakening or abandonment of bilateral nuclear arms control agreements coupled with growing attention to great power competition and nuclear modernization on the one hand, but also the growing divide between the nuclear haves who see nuclear weapons as essential for their security and the nuclear have-nots who think that the nuclear weapon states are not only eschewing their international obligations, but also providing a source of insecurity and instability in the world as a result. And as we well know, this has been a deepening problem for the nuclear non-proliferation regime. So these might be considered questions of weapons management and proliferation, as Jeff has in the book, but I also wonder if the categories of behavior themselves are shifting away from management to modernization for the nuclear weapon states, and away from non-proliferation to prohibition to the non-nuclear weapon states. On the conventional side, we might observe the growth of rules meant to restrain the trade in small and major conventional arms and to ban, full stop, specific weapons thought to be inherently indiscriminate. The first suggests who might get to get weapons based on their internal activities, human rights violations, conflict, genocide. The second seeks to fully delegitimize discrete categories of weapons for everybody. More practically, however, we can see debates about trade, proliferation, and regulation that might overlap in some ways with the nuclear weapons regimes, but also about transparency and reporting, stockpile controls, and in some cases, prohibition. So we have a much wider range of behaviors here, particularly since they haven't been historically curtailed by great powers or international institutions in the way that nuclear weapons have been. In these growing political divides of interest, I wonder if the key governance questions themselves change. Would different actors ask different questions? Whose versions of the questions matter the most? As Jeff notes, maybe these subsystems are changing in different ways and at different speeds. And I wonder if that puts new questions on the table. For example, can any technology today truly be blocked? Even if it was meant to encompass the taboo, is it enough to ask in what ways can nuclear weapons be used for deterrence, compellence, and force? How do we compensate those suffering from the health and environmental consequences of testing? If we look beyond the US and Russia especially, Jeff's framework might help us to identify the seeds for change as other actors start to assert their own governance questions and shift the governance conversation in the nuclear weapons space. We might see broadly similar conversations, questions in the conventional weapons space, particularly as we see more dual use technologies emerge, but less happening until the 1990s and 2000s for the most part, when states start to become willing simply to ask these questions in a multilateral forum. What pushes the international community then to take up an issue as a collective governance question or not? When and why do conventional weapons go from being seen as ungovernable and a matter for state sovereignty to something for which the trade could in some cases be regulated and some weapons even be banned, even if they are already widely dispersed in their technology? These questions do not simply appear on the scene, but are the product of careful strategizing and politicking by actors in favor of their consideration. And Jeff's framework helps us think about those questions, but also the multitude of actors that might be involved in asking them. Third, Jeff asks us to think about sort of the specifics of the issue area itself. Who are the constituent actors? What are the punishments, the instruments of coercion, and so on? And here I think we can see some particularly interesting divides between the conventional and nuclear arms control areas. Nuclear has traditionally aligned with the interests of great powers, causing them, and especially the United States, to take on an enforcement role, support the IAEA governing arrangements and technical expertise and bureaucratic knowledge around the issue. But as the non-nuclear weapon states have pushed for and adopted the nuclear ban treaty in the absence of great power support, perhaps we need to reconsider the strategic costs and benefits and the need for coercion and punishment in the nuclear proliferation subsystem. For most states, to adhere to the non-proliferation regime might not be really a matter of punishment anymore. So we don't see the same rich sort of great power engagement and institutional framework that has traditionally existed with the nuclear weapons subsystems so much on the conventional side, where we have similar actors, maybe even more, with more industry, more NGOs taking on bigger roles, but also with less engagement with punishment and coercion as well. In particular, we see less of an interest from the great powerful states in enforcing the rules themselves or even creating strong bureaucratic structures to help them do that. The benefits here in conventional arms control might also be more other-oriented than self-interested. In the conventional arms trade regime in particular, we might see very little behavior that ultimately lines up with the subsystem and regime that's meant to govern it. Finally, the fourth question, Jeff asks us to investigate the dynamics and political contestation within and across subsystems. And I think this is one of the most interesting, deeply political areas that the book helps us get into. And for my part, I want to ask sort of what are the areas of overlap that we might see between these two arms control subsystems and what their consequences might be for one another. So we might in part attribute some of the strong historical reluctance to take more sweeping action on broad categories of conventional weapons, complemented by sort of greater technological development on conventional weapons and sophistication of conventional weapons because of ruling out, to some extent, for many states, nuclear options. Because you can't have nuclear weapons, you might want to invest more and make sure you have better access to better conventional weapons. States want more usable weapons to be accessible to them. And so they've been more reluctant potentially with conventional arms. We also see little to no formal enforcement built into agreements in the conventional realm, with little threat of informal enforcement beyond sort of naming and shaming. At the same time, we see lessons from what worked in conventional arms control, in particular cases like landmines and cluster munitions, now deliberately adopted by ICANN and the nuclear ban movement. So spreading over from the conventional weapon space into the nuclear prohibition movement. I thought there's a couple of additional interesting ideas that come out of Jeff's theory and analysis. I thought the role of rational myths, like Dan, was really interesting, and the narratives that sort of help it all hang together. even if they're a little hollow underneath, which is the case with the oil case. And that makes me wonder if it's really ultimately with all these cases really about the strategic costs and benefits of the subsystems, or maybe the political value that actors get out of it and the political belief that sustains it. So when those crumble or are put to test in meaningful ways, we might realize how little they are materially based and how easily they fall apart when they're just poked a little bit. I also think that meaningful enforcement in Jeff's model is really central, but the politics of getting it are extremely difficult. States don't want to be bound in these ways. And if it all leans on this, then it's no wonder that many of the subsystems we have in international politics are so dependent on the narratives, the myths, the political and normative costs and benefits of the subsystem, perhaps therefore as fragile as they are. So I think Jeff's theory leads us to ask fundamentally important questions, but also opens up more questions about the politics of making these governance questions in the process. And I think that's what a really good book does. It starts these conversations, opens up the possibility for questions. And I think that we will be better scholars of IR and better policymakers if we attend to them. So thank you.
I imagine Jeff has some responses, but before we get to that, let's open it up to questions, comments from the audience.
A couple of mics, actually.
All right, here we go. Yeah, so because we're live streaming this, it would be great if, for those who have questions.
I just turn them on.
Yeah. Questions? You might say that you can introduce yourself.
So Andrew Peterson from the School of Engineering. I found it really interesting, the part about how you mentioned there's sort of a bargain between the protector and, you know, getting the resource. You said that's changed today from what it once was. And we're hearing that we're not sort of getting that return from Saudi Arabia today, let's say. What is the bargain today? What is it that we're getting back?
Yeah. So it's complicated, and the relationship, as Amy pointed out, is sort of changed over time. It's deteriorated in certain ways, and I think part of what's going on with U.S. and Saudi Arabia is that there is now, because of the politics of climate change and the push in the United States to get off of oil, even though that's probably still distant, not just years down the road, but maybe decades down the road, it nonetheless creates a time horizon, an end date to this fundamental bargain. And that's something that the anticipation of that time horizon, the cliff edge of that, is something that worries Saudi policymakers quite a lot, and understandably. And they have to think about, well, we've been relying on the US for military security. How are we going to get it in the absence of US protection? So you can imagine them raising their own army. They have some problems doing that. Their population is not very interested in military service. They have another option that they could try to find a different protector. And so one can imagine the politics of that, although that also turns out to be complicated. Not very many countries in the world can project force to the Persian Gulf. It's a difficult thing to do, as the US has proven again and again, unfortunately. And so, but to come back to your question about how those benefits are delivered, the United States benefits in a couple of ways, sometimes through sort of the mechanisms that Amy was elucidating, that there are kind of covert asks, quiet asks that the United States can make of the US government. The Saudis also price their oil in dollars, which turns out to be, it sounds like a very technical thing. They could price it in Saudi riyals, but the fact that they price it in dollars and other petrostates price it in dollars is one of, maybe not the only, but one of the key underpinnings of the status of the United States dollar as kind of the hegemonic currency that the world uses. And that turns out to give the United States enormous power, right? So there's real privilege to that. There's a whole book called Exorbitant Privilege centered around the idea that the dollar is the reserve currency of the world. And so that's one of the benefits. There's another one, namely arms sales, which the Saudis and many other petrostates purchase weapons in huge quantities. So if you put, so Saudi Arabia on its own is the #2 purchaser of weapons from the United States in the world. And meaning not just the #2 of customer of the United States, but also the #2 customer globally. But if you put sort of Saudi Arabia and UAE and Kuwait together, they are by far #1. And so this matters a lot. It mattered in particular in the sort of 70s and 80s when the arms manufacturers, the Lockheed Martins of the world and Raytheon companies, these companies used to be a quite small fraction of corporate America. And it grew massively in the late 70s and 80s when the petrostates came into all of this wealth and wanted to spend some dollars in part to solidify that relationship. Okay, so I've gone on too long to answer that question, but thank you so much, Andy, for it, and thanks for coming.
Other questions? Yep.
Debbie Gordon. So just back, and I'm here at Watson, just back from Glasgow. It's interesting to watch, and I'm curious how you would react to this with the theory, just looking beyond Saudi Arabia. What's being called the new producers group is standing up. This is the global South. There's like 40 countries in the global South that have oil and gas resources that are a bit mad as hell because they're being told no new production because of climate change when, it's the US and Russia and Saudi Arabia that have owned this market forever. And I'm just curious how the arguments in your book talk to the future of other international order that might be picking up here.
Yeah, so the politics of the global energy transition, as you know, having just published a book on oil politics, are incredibly complicated, and they're, there are real tensions between the sort of incumbent producers, and in particular, Saudi Arabia, Russia, and the United States are the big three, right? Those are the three largest producers of oil and gas by far. And all the others lag by almost an order of magnitude. And so those three have been not necessarily cooperatively, but they've been at the top of the market for a long time. And yes, there is now a push not just on oil and gas, but more generally the dynamic between the global North and the global South on climate change is, as you know, problematic, where the global North is saying, we don't want you to be using coal or to be manufacturing steel in the dirtiest possible way and all of that. And the global South says, first of all, you're doing the exact same thing right now. You haven't got your own house in order. But also, even if you were to get your house in order, we would like to climb up the sort of ladder of economic development the same way that you have in the last 150 years. Let us do it. And so there's going to be real tensions there. My colleague Mark Blythe likes to point out that sort of India is waiting to be bribed, I think is the phrase that he uses, which I think is sort of captures this nicely, this idea that they're going to keep producing coal and powering their electrical system by coal until they are bribed by others to stop doing it. And that's obviously deeply worrying because so much of the coal consumption in the world is happening in India and China, and that sort of the arc between. So that's a driving force.
But let me just throw out this other thing. So there's something called the Lofoten Declaration after some island in Norway, and a group of scholars and activists and national leaders got together and posted this declaration that basically said kind of what you're saying, which is that Norway and the UK and the US all got the benefit of development of their oil revenue, and countries like Guyana and others that have oil now and have not had a chance to develop their economies. If we're going to have a limited amount of oil we can use, we, the new producers, like the Guianas, we deserve to be able to sell our oil, and somebody else should shut their oil in. And in Europe, actually there's a movement, right? Which is, should Norway really be producing oil anymore? And maybe they should make space for Guyana. And should that be part of the global climate change negotiations? Because you could imagine now being this volatility in oil prices, which we will continue to see unless we address this issue, which is, how are we going to divide this world for the oil we're going to keep using for some period of time? And, does Saudi Arabia just get to do it because its oil is the cheapest, regardless of what they do with the money and how many people live inside their country? Or are there places that should be allowed to develop because, that would be more just and inclusive to countries in the global south? And I think in places like Norway and Denmark and even off the coast of Scotland, which is how the chairman of Shell got very widely attacked at the TED Talks, because Shell is talking about drilling a new field off of Scotland. I think there's this sense in Europe that maybe we're wealthy enough to turn off our oil production. And then that's very unpopular with certain segments of the population inside those countries. And you could imagine how the kind of debate that would happen in the United States if we started saying we were going to turn off our oil production to leave space for Guyana, right? So I do think it's a conundrum that no one talks about that is worth talking about and thinking about. Saudi Arabia's position is that the countries that have the cheapest cost oil will win. They'll get to stay in the market longest. And therefore, their best investment is to make the carbon intensity of their production low enough that they can be the last man standing. But, as Jeff says, that's what the beauty of his book. If we're going to be thinking about, subsets, right, of how we're going to ask different governance questions. We don't have the Seven Sisters anymore. And, the United States faced a question actually earlier in the last year because the United Arab Emirates was thinking about quitting OPEC. And literally, people had to have a discussion about whether OPEC was necessary or not as an institution. And, you might all say, well, why would we ever think OPEC's a necessary institution? I know Jeff doesn't put much stock in it, right? But in 2020, when demand collapsed like it did with COVID, it was actually very important to have an international governance system for oil, because you could have gotten a weird thing where you could have had so much oil that you could have had a shock where you and I wouldn't be able to get oil at the gasoline station because there was so much oil in tanks that there was no way to do the logistics of moving oil from point A to point B. There was actually a really dangerous window in April of 2020 where we had to coerce the Saudis not to let their oil land in the United States and fill every last tank, right? So there is this interesting question at the extremes. Do I need to keep an institution because I have to deal with it in the extremes, right? Do I have to have some kind of management system? Do I have the bat phone? I have to be able to call Batman, with the bat phone on one particular time, and therefore I have to keep this institution going. And why do I keep this institution going? And that's what I liked about Jeff's book. I can't say I agreed with everything he said about OPEC or oil. It's really more that the framework he's created, for arms control, for oil, for some of these subsets, has much stronger explanatory power and would allow young scholars to take historical events and organize them in a way that's easier to think it through and understand the different power dynamics among actors.
Dan, did you have a point?
I guess I had a question, so in response to what you said, and you know, you've given me an opportunity to push back on Blythe, so I have to take that, which is to say, there we go. Fair enough. I generally accept the idea that India is waiting to be bribed. You know, the idea that there are countries that are producing coal and hydrocarbons in massive quantities. Are they going to get bailed off? Here's my taboo question, because I don't know if this has ever been publicly articulated. As I understand it, that's fair if you think that the subsystem is mitigation. But if the subsystem is adaptation, there is a very nasty, you know, situation coming down the pike in which it turns out that the developed world, the ones who have been polluting all this time, are actually not that bad off and reasonably well set up to guard against the worst aspects of climate change, whereas India and China, on the other hand, are going to be in deep, deep trouble. And so I guess my question is, at what point does that start to affect their preferences on this topic?
I would add to that, because Jeff doesn't have a chapter on that, so if there's a young scholar in the room looking for a chapter. The global food system is going to be the new place of pressure, right? And especially for China and countries like that, where they don't have the kind of natural resources we do and the variation in climate in terms of what we do. The whole question of food security and who is the strong player in terms of making sure they can feed their population and who isn't going forward with climate change is going to bring, in my opinion, a dramatic challenge to the current governance system.
Yeah, so food prices and the food system is really tightly interlinked with energy, right? Just because of fertilizers and all the rest, that when energy prices go up, food prices go up almost every time. And they're not perfectly correlated, but they're quite tight. So I think that we will see strains and of course trade-offs, particularly when we're talking about alternative fuels like biodiesels or sustainable aviation fuels or what have you, get trade-offs between growing crops for fuel versus growing crops to eat them. But Dan's question about India is a really good one, and it's a tricky one. And certainly Bangladesh is arguably the country that is most worried or should be most worried about climate change, because it's a low-lying country and you've got about 100 million people who are on a floodplain, right? And so India has to then worry about Bangladesh, because where do those 100 million people go, right? And so yes, you would think that in a remotely quasi-rational world, states would be forward-looking and anticipate that. And yet, you know, India has politics too, and the United States is no more forward-looking than we would like anyway, right? So this problem of forward-looking strategies, it doesn't have nearly as much bite on current behaviors as we might hope, right? Is the way I would think about it.
Mark.
So let me push back entirely on Jeff's framework.
Okay, awesome.
All of it. So here's a different story. In 1974, Richard Nixon phoned up the Saudis and said, if you look out to your left, you will see the entire Nimitz battle group parked offshore. We don't care if you make oil $100 a barrel, so long as it goes through our banking system. And it did. And that became a problem by 1978. Because of inflation in the system. And there was a guy called Walter Wriston who ran Citibank who came along and said, I have a solution. I'm going to give it to governments in Latin America because governments never go broke, quote unquote. And after the interest rate reversal brought on by the Volcker shock, we know the story. Basically, all of that money gets torched. They don't get it back. It's the Saudis who ultimately lose on this one because the Western banking system is protected by the Fed. And then by 1986, oil prices go down, we're back to square one. So in other words, subsystem, schmub system, the hegemon wins. Now, let's project this forward into the future, because you take the end of the book and you pivot and you go to climate change, right? And say, well, what's the lessons here? Well, I wonder if there's a lesson that's about subsystems, but it's not the one you think, which is the following. And it relates to what we've been talking about with India and so on. So basically about 70% of all likely future emissions that need to be taken care of come out of India and China. That's it. We're already decarbonizing by default because we're deindustrializing. And what you see across the whole world is premature deindustrialization. So effectively, it's really those two countries and perhaps Indonesia where the whole thing's going to be figured out. As Dan points out, they have every incentive, given the fact of wet bulb temperatures, flooding, and all the rest of it, not to hold out for bribery. And perhaps that will prove to win the day. But ultimately, it's all decided there. Whatever the hegemon is, dollars or not, it doesn't matter. It's what matters there. So how would you reflect on those two challenges to your framework?
So I think you're wrong in multiple ways. This is what I love about having Mark as a colleague, is that he always has really provocative and helpful ways of pushing the thinking. And so one part on the earlier part of the story, you know, subsystems, the idea of, you know, we went through the 70s, but then 1986 comes and the prices go back down. We're all back to square one. That's not what happened, actually. So that the price of oil, and it's worth knowing this, is that in 1970, the price of oil was like $1.82 a gallon, right? Today it's $80 a gallon. And after 1973, of course, you know, inflation happened. So if you adjust this, oh, I'm sorry, there's a barrel. Thank you. $1.82 a barrel. If you adjust for inflation, though, the difference between today's price and the price in the early 70s looks smaller. But the fact is that it went up a notch and never came back down. Right. So this is actually the fundamental difference between what happened in 73, which is later called the first oil shock, and then there was a second oil shock in 79. But that one really was like, it went up and then it went back down, right? And that was sort of volatility. The one in 73 was a shift in time, and it stayed that way. And it did contain this power shift where decision-making authority shifted from some Anglo-American oil companies to national oil companies that were run by the Saudis and Venezuelans and Iranians, et cetera. And so
I would take it to a different point of view, or the same point, but a different way of explaining.
Okay, but what's asking that?
It was the first
Can I
time that
listen
the
to Jeff?
global South had a successful institution that challenged the West, period.
Right. And so that in turn, OPEC's success inspired NEO, et cetera. But anyway, so I would contest the sort of the history of that. Just doesn't match. And the idea that Nixon didn't care that oil prices went up is not true at all, right? So, you know, Nixon and Kissinger, they were all freaking out because they knew how electorally significant energy prices are, which is the same reason why Biden is worried about it today. As you know, and this is sort of one of the kind of constants of not only American politics, but most places in the world, that, you know, rising energy prices are political death for incumbents, right? So this is a real concern. But anyway, back to climate change, I would just say the problem is we can't wash our hands of the problem quite as much to say that it's India, China, and Indonesia, because yes, that's where the growth in emissions are, but we are still, we're not sort of taking care of net zero on its own by default. I think that's far too rosy, right? That our emissions have essentially plateaued in the last 5 or 6 years, but they haven't gone down. They're basically trickling along, and unless we make a push on them, then they will go down, right? So in Europe, they've actually started to trend down. In the United States, they haven't, and they are nowhere near the sort of you know, black diamond ski slope that we need them to be to meet anywhere close to, I mean, never mind 1.5 degrees Celsius, 2 degrees Celsius is still a really significant stretch, I think.
The United States is the second largest emitter in the world. Let's not get confused.
No, I'm not confused, but if you look at the growth of likely emissions over the next 30 years, and you've had to got effective substitution for green tech in the United States just done by the market, we are a constant, they're the variable. And that's the important part. I worry about the fact that this is the last gasp in your book of the essential nature of the Americans, that without us doing our bit, somehow it's not going to work. And I think that's just a dangerous delusion.
Yeah, we're number 2, right? And so without China, it's not going to happen. But it's also probably true that it's not going to happen without the United States, and it's not going to happen without 2 other players, right? The EU and India. Like those 4 emitters are just so crucial to the whole story.
We have time for one last question in the back. Patsy, could somebody pass the microphone? Thanks. And I'll ask for quick responses on the part of the panel.
Okay, thanks for this really fascinating panel and congratulations, Jeff. I will buy the book. But I just wanted to raise a question. You're focusing a lot on states, but there are oil companies involved. Guyana had oil all this time. It's only just being developed, not because the Guyanese government wants it now. They would have been happy to have this oil developed 50 years ago. So obviously, the people who make the decision are the people with the technology, who know where there are reserves, who know when they are going to bring a certain type of technology to access those reserves. And it seems to me that the companies, I don't know how you address those in your book and their role in that whole power dynamic. I just want to make a comment, since I'm from the Caribbean and you mentioned the Guyana and the whole question of leaving oil to poor countries. All that's going to happen, if that were to happen, is that they would be shut out of the technological changes that would be occurring in developed countries to wean themselves away from oil and fossil fuels. And they would be stuck again at the bottom of the pit with all of the negative consequences. Georgetown is below sea level. They have to keep the sea out with a seawall, right? That they've already find challenging to address. And that brings us to the whole question of IR and the focus on power and the focus on the next conflict. Whether Saudi Arabia is going to continue to need the US because it needs weapons. Against whom? For what? You know, the world is collapsing. When are we going to start to come up with a dynamic that looks at how we can balance the different needs and come up with a common humanity? And that's what, that's where this discussion is leading me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. We have just 2 minutes, so we'll try for some very quick comments in response or concluding comments as well.
Well, I won't say much other than to say that the book ends very much on the point that where you're pointing us to, which is to say that the analysis in the book is very much focused on realism and sort of understanding the world as it is, as painful as that is sometimes. But it ends with a much more kind of idealist notion that we have to imbue our understanding of the world with some values and some sense of where we want it to go, because otherwise the analysis is just sort of dry as dust and doesn't speak to the questions that it ought to speak to.
And I'm just going to get a final word in here. We've had a governance system ruled by men for the benefit of them as individuals, whether that benefit is financial or power. And what you're describing is a society where we're not ruled by that elite of patriarchy. You're talking about a society that would put the needs of people first, which under climate change conditions is an imperative. It's an imperative. And if you look at Glasgow today, you were there, you've got thousands of young people standing outside the hall, many of whom are women, who have a clear understanding that the whole governance system has to be changed or we won't survive. And that is really what your comment gets to. Whether or not Guyana is just going to be like any other country making secret deals with Exxon and paying off a few people in the society, or whether we're going to bring, solar and other kinds of technologies to the Caribbean and to Hawaii and other places, and have a system and a fair system for having people live safely and continue to live safely, either in the Caribbean or in some other place where dislocated people would have to be relocated. And in the governance system we have today, in the governance system we have today is not equipped to answer that question.
Jennifer, any final comments?
No.
Dan?
No way I'm following that. No.
Well, with that, let me first thank you all in the audience, and I especially want to thank our panelists, Dan Drezner, Amy Myers Jaffe, Jennifer Erickson, and of course, Our author today, Jeff Colgan. Thank you.